Good morning, everyone. Let's start by considering the core idea behind educational assessment. We know it's not just about tests or exams, but it is a broad process to evaluate what students have learned. I believe the goal should be not just to measure knowledge, but also to improve teaching and learning methods. What do you think is the most important aspect of educational assessments?
I agree, but let's think about this is a bit deeper. Could it be that the way we assess students might limit the learning process itself? For example, if we only focus on the standardized assessments, we might overlook a student's ability to think critically or creatively. So, isn't it important to consider how we define success in educational assessments?
That's a great point. When we talk about success and assessment, should we only measure knowledge or should we consider the process of learning? For instance, formative assessment focus more on learning development. But how can we balance this ongoing assessment with the final evaluations, like summative assessments, without favoring one over the other?
That's interesting. If we look at summative assessments, their goal is to measure the outcome, right? But is there a way to make them more effective of students' overall progress, not just their final result? How can we improve summative assessments without compromising their purpose?
I think it ties back to the principles of assessment you mentioned. For instance, reliability and validity are essential, but what if they aren't sufficient? Could an assessment still be reliable to capture real world application, which would undermine its authenticity? How do we ensure that assessments are truly reflective of what students will face outside the classroom?
Yes, exactly. Authenticity is vital. But how can we maintain it while still adhering to the logistic of practicality? Designing an assessment that is both authentic and easy to administer seems challenging. Can we make it practical without losing the true purpose of the assessment, which is to capture the depth of student understanding?
That brings us back to the need for balance, right? We can't just focus on reliability or objectivity alone. For example, in large scale assessments, we might need to ensure objectivity and practicality. But does that compare the student's ability to demonstrate creativity or complex problem solving? Can we design assessments that maintain these qualities but also allow for individual expression?
That's the core of the issue, isn't it? And perhaps if we were to focus on interpretability, meaning how will we understand and apply assessment results? How can we ensure that assessments give us meaningful insights? For example, do we always interpret the results in a way that truly informs teaching or just as a final score?
Exactly. And when we talk about interpretability, how can we ensure that data from assessment guide not just student improvement, but also teacher development? Could it be that the effectiveness of an assessment is not just in what it reveals about students' performance, but how it helps educators grow?
That's a fantastic angle. I think it would be beneficial if assessments were not just a one time measure, but also part of an ongoing feedback loop. If assessments could serve as both tools for improvement and tools for reflection, it would give us a more holistic view of both teaching and learning. How can we make that happen though?
To make that work, wouldn't we need to rethink the way we assess the whole learner? We often focus on what they know, but what about how they think, solve problems, or adapt to challenges? Can assessments evolve to capture all those aspects of learning?
That's the future of assessment, isn't it? Moving beyond knowledge to include critical thinking and problem solving, But then we return to the questions of practicality. How can we integrate these sophisticated assessments in a way that is both feasible for educators and meaningful for students?
Well, it seems like the real challenge lies in designing assessments that are multidimensional but still practical. Maybe we need to focus on assessments that don't just measure outcomes but also foster learning. Could we envision a system where assessments themselves become part of the learning process, encouraging growth rather than merely evaluating it?
We will continue by discussing assessment for learning. This type of assessments helps teachers monitor students' progress and adjust their teaching strategies accordingly. Do you think assessment for learning is better than summative assessment in terms of improving student performance?
I think both are important, but assessment for learning is more dynamic since it allows teachers to make adjustments while students are still in the learning process. Do you think formative assessments are enough or should they be combined with summative assessments to get a complete picture of students' abilities?
It seems that formative assessments give more immediate feedback, but summative assessments provide a final snapshot. Maybe a combination of both can provide a more holistic view of a student's growth. How do you think assessment for learning can be used in real life settings like in a workplace?
Next, I'll talk about assessment as learning. This type of assessment involves students assessing their own learning, fostering metacognitive skills. How do you think self assessment affects students' ownership of their learning process?
Self-assessment encourages reflection, which helps students understand their strengths and areas of improvement. But do you think all students are capable of accurately assessing themselves? Or might there be bias in their self-evaluations?
That's a valid concern. Self assessment works best when students have the skills to reflect critically. It's also important for teachers to guide students in using rubrics or feedback from peers to develop more accurate self assessments. Do you think peer assessments can also contribute to students' learning, or might they create conflicts?
Finally, we have assessment of learning, or also known as summative assessment. This type of assessment focuses on summarizing what has been learned over a period of time. How do you think the feedback from the summative assessment influences student motivation?
Summative assessment can provide important feedback, but if it's just a final grade, it might not help students understand their progress. How could we improve the way summative assessment are used to support ongoing learning?
That's a good point. Maybe summative assessments should be accompanied by detailed feedback so students can see where they excelled and where they need to improve. How do you think summative assessments could be used in a way that encourages a growth mindset?
Well, I think summative assessment should focus less on just assigning a grade and more on how students can use the feedback to improve. For example, providing opportunities for a student to revise and resubmit work based on feedback might encourage them to view assessments as part of a learning process rather than just an endpoint.
I think we've discussed a lot of important aspects of educational assessments today. The variety of types, from formative to summative, all serve different purposes and can be used to support student growth in different ways. What do you think is the most effective type of assessment for motivating students?
It seems like formative assessment might be the most motivating since they allow students to grow and learn continuously without the stress of final exams. But summative assessments with constructive feedback can also guide future improvements.
I agree. Both types can be effective when combined and when assessment are used to promote learning rather than just to evaluate it. Ultimately, it's about using the right tool at the right time. Thank you everyone for your insights.
Hey everyone! Let's start by clarifying what assessment really is. We've heard about test, testing, measurement, evaluation, and assessment. But how are they different from each other?
That's a great question. From what I understand, a test is a tool or an instrument used to measure knowledge, skills, or abilities. Testing, on the other hand, is the actual process of administering the test. Do you both agree?
I do, but let me challenge that a bit. If testing is the process, how does it differ from measurement? Because measurement also involves gathering data, right?
That's an interesting point. Measurement is about quantifying results. It involves numbers. For example, if a teacher checks a test and records that a student got 18 out of 20, that's a measurement. But evaluation goes beyond just numbers. How would you define evaluation?
Evaluation involves judgment. It's about interpreting those scores to make decisions. If a student gets a low score, the teacher has to determine if the lesson was effective or if the student needs extra help. And evaluation always includes criteria. Do you think it's possible to measure learning without evaluating it?
That's a tough one. Measurement alone gives us data, but without evaluation, we would not know what that data means in context. And that's bring us to assessment, which seems to be the biggest umbrella term here. How would you define assessment in relation to all of this?
Assessments is the entire process. It includes collecting data, testing and measurement, interpreting it, evaluation, and making instructional decisions is both qualitative and quantitative. So, all these terms are connected under assessment.
That makes sense. Now, let's go deeper. Why do teachers give tests? Are they just meant to measure knowledge, or is there a bigger purpose?
I think tests serve different purposes. They help evaluate what students have learned, identify strengths and weaknesses, and even determine how effective the teaching method is. But do you think tests are always a fair measure of learning?
That's a critical question. Some students may not perform well on tests due to anxiety, even if they understand the material. That's why we need different types of assessment, not just tests. Speaking of which, do you know the difference between standardized tests and teacher made tests?
Yes, standardized tests are created by experts and follow strict guidelines, like the National Achievement Test or board exams. Teacher made tests, on the other hand, are designed by classroom teachers specifically for their students. Which do you think is more effective?
That depends on the goal. Standardized tests provide a broad measure of competency, but teacher-made tests are more tailored to what students actually learn in class. Maybe we need both for a balanced approach.
That's a great point. Before we move on, let's reflect. How do these assessment tools affect how we learn and how teachers teach?
Well, if tests are used effectively, they can guide learning, but if they're just used for grading without feedback, they might not help students improve.
Exactly. Assessment should be more than just a numbers. It should be a tool for growth. Maybe the next part of our discussion we can explore what makes a good test and how it should be designed.
I agree. Let's continue this discussion in part 2, where we'll analyze the qualities of an effective assessment and its impact on learning. Now that we understand the different types of assessment, let's dive into what makes an assessment effective. What do you think are the key characteristics?
I think a good assessment should be valid. It should measure what it's supposed to measure. If a math test includes too many reading comprehension questions, is it really testing math skills?
That's a great point. Another important factor is reliability. A test should yield consistent results. If the same student takes the test twice under similar conditions, their scores should not change drastically.
I agree. And don't forget about fairness. Assessments should be unbiased and accessible to all students, regardless of their background or abilities. What about practicality? Should that be a factor?
Definitely. An assessment should be practical. It shouldn't be too complicated or time consuming for teachers to administer and grade. A well designed test balances all these factors.
That makes sense, but beside tests, what another assessment methods can help improve learning?
There are a lot. Formative assessments like quizzes, peer reviews, and self assessments help students learn while they're still in the process of mastering a topic. Summative assessments like final exams or projects measure learning at the end of the unit. Do you think one is more important than the other?
I don't think so. I think both are essential. Formative assessments provide ongoing feedback, while summative assessments show overall progress. What about alternative assessments like portfolios or presentations?
Those are great because they allow students to showcase their learning in different ways. Not everyone excels at traditional tests, so having multiple assessment methods can give a more complete picture of a student's abilities.
Exactly. The best assessment strategies are diverse and cater to different learning styles. To wrap up, how can teachers use assessment to not just grade students but actually improve their learning?
They should use assessment results to guide instruction. If many students struggle with a topic, that's a sign that the teacher needs to revisit it. Also, providing detailed feedback helps students understand their mistakes and improve.
Right, assessment should not just be one-way street where students receive grades. They should be part of learning process where both teachers and students reflect and grow.
Well said! Assessment, when done right, isn't just about scores. It's about helping students succeed. Let's keep that in mind as we continue our learning journey.